Around 12,900 years ago, the last ice age met its demise in utter devastation as extreme climate change and immense mega-scale floods wreaked havoc across the Earth in one of the most catastrophic global events that has occurred in the last several million years. Evidence for this catastrophe is still being uncovered from all around the world. In September of 2021, we went on a fantastic tour with independent researcher Randall Carlson to explore the Channeled Scablands of Washington and see for ourselves the evidence of the gargantuan floods of exceptional power and size that left a geological record scoured into the landscape. The floods that swept across the 16,000 square mile region are some of the largest floods ever documented on Earth. In this video, we'll show you the most prominent features of the Scablands and give you an idea of the grand scale of what took place here. We had an amazing time on this week-long tour that was co-hosted by Randall's longtime friend and sidekick, Brad Young, Graham and Darren from Grimerica, Russ and Kyle from the Brothers of the Serpent, and Ben from Uncharted X. Go check out their channels and podcasts if you haven't already. We shared a rich and inspiring journey out in the field with a great group of people from all around the continent. Before we get into the tour, we want to take a moment to give a shout out to our first Patreon supporters, Rob Sanders, Will Sessions, and Uni Krishna. We're so grateful for your support, and we really appreciate you helping us to continue to make awesome videos and devote more time to this channel. If you feel inspired to support us on Patreon, the link is in the description below. We'll be sharing lots of exclusive material with our patrons regarding the Scablands, as well as many other sites, so feel free to join one of our reward tiers and receive some sweet bonus content.
Randall Carlson is a master builder, architectural designer, teacher, geometrician, geological explorer, and renegade scholar. We've been following his work since he made multiple appearances on the Joe Rogan podcast. Graham Hancock also joined Randall in a few episodes, and they helped bring widespread awareness of the role that ancient cataclysms play in human and geological history. They spoke at length about the extraordinary series of events that took place at the end of the last ice age, roughly between about 10,000 and 15,000 years ago. During this time period, the Earth experienced extreme climate change, with several temperature fluctuations of around 15 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 10 years. There were also enormous wildfires, drastic sea level rises of about 400 feet, and other major ecological disasters. The Younger Dryas cooling period, between around 12,900 and 11,600 years ago, was a particularly catastrophic time of extreme glacially cold conditions, when the human population abruptly declined through a genetic bottleneck. The Clovis culture in North America went extinct, along with the woolly mammoths, elephant-sized ground sloths, giant armadillos, saber-toothed cats, and many more species of megafauna. The cause of many of these events is uncertain, although there is a growing body of evidence, mostly from the Comet Research Group, that the onset of the Younger Dryas may have been triggered by a cosmic impact. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that the North American ice cap, as well as other regions across at least 4 continents, were struck by multiple fragments of a disintegrating comet, leaving behind a black matte layer deep in the soil strata, and extraterrestrial impact proxies such as melt glass, nanodiamonds, platinum, and impact spherules, some of which were melted by temperatures in excess of 2,200 degrees Celsius, which is 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit.
The long-withstanding mainstream consensus about the Channeled Scablands was that they were formed by multiple floods that rapidly drained out of the giant glacial Lake Missoula caused by the recurrent breaking of a 2,000-foot-tall ice dam. This ice dam was an extension of the Cordilleran ice sheet called the Purcell Trench Lobe that blocked the Clark Fork River and backed up water to fill Lake Missoula in what is now Montana. During the final stages of the Ice Age, Lake Missoula grew to around 3,000 square miles, containing as much water as Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined. It is theorized to have periodically drained every 30 to 100 years or so, each flood releasing as much as 500 or 600 cubic miles of water into the Columbia Basin. Randall doesn't deny that Lake Missoula existed. However, he argues that its volume of water was not sufficient to account for the totality of the features in this landscape of catastrophe, and that the theory of how the ice dam formed is fundamentally flawed. At the end of the Ice Age, the Earth was warming, and it doesn't make sense that the lake would continue to refill again and again from rain and glacial meltwater, while at the same time it was cold enough for the ice dam to continue refreezing and refortifying itself, enough to hold back one of the largest lakes in North America. Randall has speculated for decades that another source of water is needed to explain the Scablands, and that the most likely cause was a comet impact directly into the Cordilleran ice cap. This would have instantaneously melted an incomprehensible amount of water that flooded down into Washington, Idaho, and Montana from the north, perhaps even catastrophically infilling Lake Missoula before it drained out to the west.
The first person to suggest that this landscape was created by catastrophic flooding was a geologist named J. Harlan Bretz in the 1920s. He originally believed that one sudden, short-lived, totally exceptional flood was the culprit, although he had no definitive answer to explain the source of the tremendous volume of water. He was met with intense skepticism by other geologists, but over the decades of debate, it was finally proven that gigantic floods did create the Scablands. Although rather than one single flood, the prevailing model accepted by mainstream geologists proposes that it was as many as 90 separate cataclysmic floods from Lake Missoula. While Lake Missoula surely did play a role, the compelling evidence for a comet requires us to consider that a single colossal flood on a much larger scale could have been the primary cause. We still have a lot of unanswered questions about this subject, and more kept arising as we put together this video, so we plan on asking Randall more about all of this when we do a podcast with him hopefully soon. If you want to dive deep into this whole mystery, we highly recommend you to listen to Randall's podcast called Kosmographia. He has more than 70 episodes discussing the scientific research regarding megafloods and comet impacts. We also recommend checking out the compilation of articles on the Comet Research Group's website, Graham Hancock's books Magicians of the Gods in America Before, Antonio Zamora's and Martin Sweatman's YouTube channels, and the Cosmic Tusks website if you want to investigate this further down the rabbit hole. The links are all down in the description, along with many other sources to check out.
Now that we got that ridiculously long intro out of the way, let's begin our tour of the flood path here at Boulder Park, which was underneath the ice cap at the end of the last ice age. Here, you can see the southern extent of the Okanagan ice lobe, outlined by what's known as a terminal moraine, a deposit of rocks and debris that mark the furthest reach of a glacier. Strewn across the Waterville Plateau are thousands of glacial erratics, which are boulders that were snatched up by slow-moving ice and then deposited in a completely different geological landscape. Erratics often travel hundreds of miles before the icebergs that rafted them finally get stranded and melt, leaving behind the large rocks. These stones are granodiorite and gneiss, and they range from the size of pebbles all the way up to house-sized megaliths that would have been transported by icebergs the size of oil tankers. One of the largest in the region, which we unfortunately didn't get to see, sits hundreds of feet up on a hillside near the town of Wenatchee and weighs an estimated 18,000 tons. The nearby Jaeger Rock is a haystack rock, the largest we saw on our trip. It weighs an estimated 400 tons and looms about 20 feet high over the desolate agricultural fields and the road that butts up against it. Haystack rocks are boulders that were torn away by glacial ice from the local basalt bedrock. These ones here were likely ripped from the cliffs about 15 miles to the north by the unfathomable pressure of subglacial water flows. Can you imagine a torrential slurry of chaos, full of icebergs and debris, tearing across this landscape and depositing these large rocks here in the middle of nowhere? Just south of Jaeger Rock, the outburst floodwaters began to channelize and downcut into a narrow passage, creating Potholes Coulee, which is the second largest canyon in the Scablands. Coulees of this region are deep, dried-up canyons that were rapidly eroded by enormous quantities of flowing water. They often contain small lakes or streams that don't even come close to possessing the amount of water power needed to create them. An immense flood would be required to erode this 40-mile-long canyon. The source of the water is controversial, although it was likely due to the rapid melting and breaking up of the ice sheet directly to the north. Supraglacial water flows, or water moving on top of the ice, and subglacial water flows, or extremely pressurized water moving below the ice, would have met right at the mouth of Moses Coulee in a raging flood of a gigantic magnitude.
So, roughly 300 to 350 million cubic feet per second is what cut this out, which is about roughly 10 times the combined flow of every river on Earth. Just to give you some kind of perspective on it. So yeah, the water's coming down here from the east, and it already made a right angle turn up there, came down, and then it just sloshed around. You can almost visualize the force of that water sweeping around this bend.
15 miles to the east is the even more impressive Grand Coulee, which is the most extraordinary feature associated with the Ice Age floods. It's separated into two parts, an upper and a lower section that total 60 miles in length. An inconceivable amount of water carved this gigantic scar into the earth, which is as deep as 1,300 feet and as much as 3 miles wide. During the Great Flood, the Okanagan ice lobe to the west would have acted as a barrier and diverted tremendous quantities of water south along its edge, channelizing the torrent into the violent formation of the longest and deepest canyon in the region. The surge of water formed a mega waterfall, estimated to have been over 800 feet tall, that eroded this 25-mile-long section of Upper Grand Coulee up to where it meets the Columbia River. It carved around and left behind the 800-foot-tall, 1-mile-long Steamboat Rock, one of the most impressive features that managed to withstand the onslaught of the floodwaters. There's even a glacial erratic that was deposited on top of this lonely rock by an iceberg that was stranded here as the surrounding bedrock was carved away. Before the downcutting began, the sheet flood that spread across the open terrain would have been perhaps a few hundred feet deep above the top of the canyon where the ground level used to be. Grand Coulee was actually completely dry until the 1930s and 40s when these two dams were built to create this artificial reservoir called Banks Lake. Upper and Lower Grand Coulee are separated by the legendary Dry Falls, a now dried up series of cataracts with 400-foot tall sheer cliffs that once hosted a waterfall close to 3 times taller than Niagara Falls and more than 6 times as wide. It was once the largest waterfall that ever existed anywhere on the planet, with 400 feet of water flowing below the rim and another 300 feet above. To quote Randall from Graham Hancock's book, "The water is coming through here in enormous quantities and horribly fast, running it up to 70 miles an hour according to some estimates, and you've got to realize that it isn't just water, it's more like a slurry of thick mud, and there's whole forests torn up by their roots that are roiling around in it, and fleets of icebergs jostling on the surface. And down at the bottom, there's a huge rumbling rubble of rocky debris, boulders, and this whole mess is rushing and tumbling and plucking as it passes." Somehow, this huge rock blade called Umatilla Rock evaded the hydraulic forces of erosion as all the bedrock around it was consumed by the flood. The magnitude of what took place here is almost unimaginable. Because there was so much water, it wouldn't have even been a recognizable waterfall. It would have just been a small dip on the surface of the raging flood.
To give you some sense of scale, here's where we stood at the lookout point. And zooming out, you can see how gargantuan the size of this canyon truly is. Next, we ventured down into the bottom of Lower Grand Coulee to Deep Lake, which sits in a smaller cataract to the east that was also sculpted by this unbelievably chaotic flood path. We did some cliff jumping here and had a great time chilling out between excursions. More than 10 cubic miles of basalt bedrock was excavated out of Grand Coulee, most of which was deposited in and beyond the Quincy Basin. Our tour's base camp was here at Soap Lake, which would have been under more than 600 feet of water. Just beyond the lake is the Ephrata Fan, where the floodwaters decelerated, spread out over a more level terrain, and deposited a 130-foot deep layer of sediment, along with thousands of enormous erratics strewn across 620 square miles. The water flowed across Quincy Basin and drained out over several main spillways to the west. The Lynch Coulee, Potholes Coulee, and Frenchman Coulee, where it then converged with the tremendous floodwaters raging down through the Columbia River from the north. The water tore straight through the top of Babcock Ridge and carved out this spectacular series of cataracts known as Potholes Coulee. A 1.5 mile wide waterfall gouged out this almost 3 mile long coulee, exposing the vertical structure of the hexagonal columnar basalt bedrock beneath the surface. The reason the flood was so erosive here is because the steep terrain caused the water to quickly descend 850 vertical feet into the Columbia River in less than 3 miles. 2 main cataracts formed around this beautiful rock blade, and extreme verticular turbulence ground out these rounded lakes. Just north in the Columbia River is a huge flood bar called West Bar. This remarkable feature exhibits some of the largest and best examples of current ripples found anywhere on Earth. We've all seen current ripples on beaches and riverbanks before, but these fluvial dunes are hundreds of times larger and were formed by floodwaters possibly around 800 feet deep, moving more than 60 miles an hour. The flood left behind this 5 mile long deposit of sand and gravel, which sits as much as 250 feet above the modern river. The ripples on top are between 20 and 40 feet tall and are spaced an average of 360 feet apart, dwarfing in magnitude anything we've witnessed from floods in modern times.
Just south of there at Frenchman Coulee, the water spilled over and eroded right through the Evergreen Ridge and found its next passage down into the Columbia. A mile-wide waterfall eroded 2 huge cataracts between 1 and 2 miles long, exposing these 300 to 400 foot tall cliffs that attract many rock climbers today. Although beautiful, the waterfall that flows here today is minuscule in comparison to the one that created this massive coulee. While the deluge raged on, the entire Quincy Basin filled up with more than 400 feet of water, drowning more than 1,000 square miles in a shallower and slower-moving sheet flood over the gradually sloping terrain. The bulk of the water exited the basin to the southeast through the Drumheller Channels, where it created an 8 to 12 mile wide cascade that was between 200 and 400 feet deep. Instead of a single centralized channel, this phenomenal scabland tract carved out a wild jumble of 150 distinct channels as much as 300 feet deep into the bedrock. This complex labyrinth of braided corridors, rock basins, cataracts, potholes, and buttes was eroded over a span of 12 miles as the terrain steepened. The water then encountered the Saddle Mountains, where it diverged and eventually met the Columbia River to the southeast through the Pasco Basin and to the west through the Crab Creek Coulee, which we didn't see on the tour. 2 other tremendous water flows descended from the northeast, scouring out the Telford Scablands Tract, which largely converged with the other flows in Quincy Basin, and the Cheney-palouse Scablands Tract that changed the course of the AncientPresenceVideo River that used to flow through the now completely dried up Washtucna Coulee.
Very good. Washtucna Coulee right here.
This is what I don't want.
Right? The water came down through and cut what is now Cheney-palouse, right? Came down here. When it hit the valley of the Snake River, the water converged in 2 directions, right? Back flooded all the way up to Lewiston, Idaho, right? Then it literally reversed the flow of the Snake River. Now, when the water flowed this way, you can see here's the Coulee, which was the original valley of the Palouse River. Here's the Snake. So this is the divide between the two. So the river came down this way, and when the flood came through, it just completely overtopped the divide and created 2 canyons, Palouse River Canyon and Devil's Canyon. So the Palouse River now, instead of flowing this way, it was captured, and it almost turns a right angle right here and goes directly down to the Snake. Once the flood was over, the Palouse River no longer occupied the valley, and it's basically what you see here now has been for 12, 13, 14,000 years. Pretty much what you see right here. And the whole floor of it is mantled with these gigantic deposits of gravel like you see right down there. So it's very interesting that most gravel deposits today are being quarried from catastrophically in place deposits. which is interesting because then that gravel is being used to make concrete. So we're building literally our cities out of the rubble of the previous world. And that's a really an actual literal way to think about it. Our cities, our roads, our bridges, all the things that use concrete. And the gravel that goes into those concrete, in almost all cases, is flood deposits, major flood deposits.
As the flood sliced directly through Devil's Canyon, it left behind a 600-foot deep, 5-mile-long gash in the earth. This corridor is so straight because it was likely a section of weaker bedrock along a fracture that the raging waters exploited. Standing at the bottom of this dramatic canyon was a beautiful experience, and we could almost feel the colossal force of the waters that eroded it. The new path of the Palouse River, carved by the flood, is a 10-mile-long scar as much as 400 feet deep. Here you can find the magnificent Palouse Falls, an almost 200-foot-high waterfall whose scale pales in comparison to the extremely erosive and powerful waters responsible for creating this canyon. The raging torrent was several hundred feet above the top of the falls and would have easily filled the canyon to the brim. One of the most vocal skeptics and longtime critics of J. Harlan Brett's massive flood theory was a geologist named James Galili, who called Brett's ideas preposterous and incompetent. He visited the Scablands with other geologists in the 50s or 60s and was dumbfounded at the scale of what he saw here. After gazing out at this waterfall for a long time in silence, he finally broke out into an immense laugh and said the famous quote, "How could anybody be so wrong?" After resisting Brett's theory for decades, he finally changed his mind after witnessing the catastrophic landscape with his own eyes. The furthest east we went on this tour was all the way over to Steptoe Butte, on the edge of the Scablands. The road to the top is an ascending spiral up to 1,000 feet above the surrounding region. This butte is the highest point for many miles, and as you climb the steep road, you get dramatic panoramas of the lush hills that roll away into the distance in every direction. We don't know a whole lot about the flooding of this region, although we've heard Randall briefly say that the floodwaters would have covered this area for short periods of time. Our summiting of the butte was timed perfectly for the sunset on the autumn equinox, which was really beautiful to witness over the vast expanse of spectacular scenery.
All of the Scabland floodwaters converged here at Pasco Basin, and the entire flood flowed through this narrow 2-mile-wide mountain gap in the Columbia River Canyon called Wallula Gap. The total reservoir volume that eventually drained through the Scablands is estimated to have been 350 million cubic feet of water per second. That's 2.6 billion gallons per second. When it reached Wallula Gap, the tremendous volumes of turbulent water, debris, and thousands of icebergs had to pass through this single bottleneck, which dammed up and rose to around 1,200 feet deep. The peak flow of this hydraulic dam is estimated to have been around 35 million cubic feet per second, which is about the total flow of all rivers on Earth combined flowing through this single gap. This choke point couldn't discharge the incoming flood fast enough, so it backflooded and created an enormous temporary lake called Lake Lewis, which covered an estimated 3,000 square miles and would have been twice the size of Rhode Island. It completely filled the Yakima and Walla Walla valleys, the Pasco, Othello, and Quincy basins, and it even flooded the Snake River Canyon more than 100 miles upriver to the border of Idaho and submerged the towns of Lewiston and Clarkston under 600 feet of water. The lake only lived for a short time. Estimates range between a few weeks and about 100 days, until the floodwaters finally subsided and passed through Wallula Gap. One of the coolest formations here is the Twin Sisters, the last surviving bedrock spires from the most narrow section of the corridor. These dramatic towers stand about 300 feet above the river and would have been under 800 or 900 feet of water flowing above them. The violent sludge of boulders and ice sheared off the surrounding cliffsides, and if the flood had persisted perhaps just for a day or two longer, the sisters would have been washed away as well.
Several miles to the east of Wallula Gap, near the town of Touche, is a place called Burlingame Canyon, which is one of the best places along the flood path to see exposed layers of sedimentary deposits called rhythmites. This backflooded region is at a higher elevation, where the slower moving slackwater of Lake Lewis deposited about 40 layers of sediment. Mainstream geologists interpret this as evidence of 40 separate floods from Lake Missoula, while Randall suggests that these layers were laid down in multiple pulses or surges within a single flood. He thinks that the rhythmites are better explained by Wallula Gap repeatedly plugging up with icebergs and debris, causing Lake Lewis to discharge and refill again and again over a short span of time. There's a lot of controversy around the topic of rhythmite layers in the flood regions, and this is a whole rabbit hole in itself. But if you want to learn more about it and dive deeper, we've linked some great articles in the description down below. Notably, this article, The Channeled Scabland Back to Brett's, which discusses this in depth. Wallula Gap is the furthest point south that we visited on our tour with Randall, but on our way back home to Southern Oregon, we followed the entire flood path all the way through the Columbia Gorge, where it finally met the Pacific Ocean. The next hydraulic dam formed at Wallula Gap near the Dalles, Oregon, and backflooded another gigantic lake called Lake Condon, which was about half the size of Lake Lewis. It covered about 1,500 square miles and submerged the entire Umatilla Basin under 1,000 feet of water all the way up to Wallula Gap. The entire 60-mile-long Columbia River Gorge was then flooded all the way to the city of Portland, with water moving at incredible speeds around 70 miles an hour at depths of 1,000 feet at Wallula Gap to around 700 feet at the end of the gorge. The river canyon was dramatically widened and deepened as the floodwater left behind turbulence-cut bench lines, huge town-sized gravel bars, depressions and undercut cliffs scoured out by churning floodwaters, and massive erratics deposited more than 800 feet high up on the hillsides.
The magnificent Multnomah Falls is one of the most beautiful features created by the flood. The tall riverbanks that used to slope gradually were sheared straight off by the raging torrent, creating this dramatic 620-foot-high vertical cliff that Oregon's tallest waterfall now plunges off of. Further downriver is the awe-inspiring Crown Point, a site that Randall said we cannot miss on our way down the flood path. This mighty outcropping of bedrock towers high above the river and provides one of the most majestic views one can find anywhere along the Columbia. This site really brought it home for us. Even way up here, more than 730 feet above the river and 300 miles from where we began our journey in this video, we would have still been underneath the floodwaters. This narrow 2-mile wide gap was the last constriction point in the gorge, after which the water slowed down, spread out to shallower depths, and engulfed the area of what is now the city of Portland. If the city had been there, only the tops of a handful of the tallest buildings would have protruded above the floodwaters. Just north of there, the flood dammed up again in another bottleneck at Wallula Gap, and proceeded to flood the entire Willamette Valley under 400 feet of water, all the way to Eugene, which is more than 130 miles away. This massive temporary lake, called Lake Allison, covered around 3,000 square miles and deposited thick layers of silt throughout the valley, making it one of the most fertile agricultural lands in the country.
After the floodwaters passed through the last 60-mile stretch of the Columbia River, they finally reached the Pacific Ocean near the town of Astoria, but they didn't stop there. The rapid-moving sludge continued flowing downslope into the seabed as hyperpycnically generated turbidity currents. In other words, the super-dense floodwater, full of prodigious volumes of gravel and debris, flowed beneath the standing ocean water and plunged out across the seafloor. It surged through the Astoria Canyon, fanned out to the north to Vancouver Island, swept out across the Astoria Fan, through the Cascadia Channel, across the Tufts Abyssal Plain, and into the Escanaba Trough, where it left a 400-foot thick layer of sediment at a depth of around 10,000 feet, more than 600 miles from where it left the land. After studying the scablands for years and finally seeing for ourselves the destructive path of the deluge basically from top to bottom, we finally have a true sense of the size and scale of the extraordinary flood events that scoured the Pacific Northwest at the end of the Ice Age. These precious landscapes tell important stories of human and geological history, and we're so grateful we've had the opportunity to go out and finally see them. The epoch around 13,000 years ago was really just yesterday, geologically speaking. Humans were definitely living here in North America during this event, and it's incredible to imagine what the survivors of this great cataclysm would have experienced. Blackened skies, prolonged torrential rains, viciously cold temperatures, and enormous wildfires would have made living during this time quite terrifying. Could this event be the origin of many of the myths and legends from around the planet that tell of the devastation of the previous world by flood and fire?
If you're interested to go out and see these landscapes for yourself, we highly recommend joining a future tour with Randall. He plans on leading several tours per year to the Channeled Scablands, as well as other regions throughout the United States that contain evidence of ancient catastrophic flooding. You can find all the info at contact@thecabin.com and the links down below. We had an amazing time with all the thought-provoking conversations, the funny moments, cliff jumping, insightful lectures, and musical jams. If you can't make it on a tour, you should definitely go see these sites on your own. They're there for you to behold, telling the epic story of ancient megafloods, and now after seeing this video, you definitely know where to look. Thank you guys so much for watching, subscribing, and hitting that like button. As always, we really appreciate you spending your time with us exploring the ancient world, and we love all your feedback and support. We plan on making more videos on the Scablands in the future, so leave a comment if you want to see videos about specific sites. We also have some supplemental information for our Patreon supporters, so feel free to join one of our reward tiers if you want some sweet bonus content. We're really grateful for the support, and your contributions help us to continue making content like this. If you want to dive deeper into what we've covered here, the description is full of links to all kinds of great articles and videos. And of course, it's always good to go back and listen to those classic Joe Rogan podcasts with Randall and Graham. If you haven't heard them, they're a must listen. For now, take care everyone, much love to you all, and we'll see you in the next video. Peace.
What do you think, Brad?
We're all filming each other.
We're filming each other, streaming each other.
I'm watching you, watching me, watching you, watching me.
Live from the side of the road. The map man.
Am I upside down?
Probably.
No, I'm not.
All hominids. Okay. There's a farmer's market that serves really good huckleberry milkshakes. So I just thought I'd mention that. Randall and the Rhythmites.
Great name for a band.
We've come up with some really great band names, haven't we?